Right, so you know when a government dumps 20,000 documents from the estate of Jeffrey Epstein, you expect the usual names to float to the top, don't you? Because the press spent years training people to brace for Clinton or some hedge fund ghoul whose lawyer is always on speed dial. What you don't expect, because nobody prepared you for it, is that the most mentioned man in the entire archive isn't even Jeffrey Epstein himself, isn't Bill Clinton, isn't Barack Obama, it's Donald Trump. 1,628 documents, a machine-verified count as that is, more than the trafficker himself. The White House didn't meet this with calm or curiosity, it went straight to calling it a Democratic smear before most people had even opened a single PDF, which tells you they weren't scared of rumours, they were scared of the count. Because once you know the archive names Trump more than Epstein, more than Clinton, more than Obama, the old barely knew him routine doesn't make it out of the opening line anymore, does it? Right, so when a government publishes 20,000 documents from the estate of a convicted trafficker, you expect the names to fall in a certain order, because that's how the public story has been told to us all for years, isn't it? You would expect Epstein himself to be at the top, wouldn't you? Obviously. You expect the usual orbit of wealthy men who kept turning up in reporting around his movements and his more public friendships after that, because the media set that frame long before any of the documents actually surfaced. What you don't expect is that the files actually show, which is that Donald Trump, the sitting president of the United States, appears in more of the documents than literally anybody else. That's what the data says. It's not opinion, not inference, not a political read-in, a machine-verified entity count built on the full 20,000 document release. 1,628 documents mention Trump. Epstein himself appears in 1,060. Obama in 421. Bill Clinton in 392. That puts the President of the United States at the very top of the record of a man whose network ran through trafficking, blackmail, manipulation, and elite protection. And once you've seen a number like that, you can't look back at the public lines Trump has used for so long now, because soundbites like barely knew him, or saw him a few times, or fell out with him and never saw anything, well, they don't survive a count like that, do they? The record contradicts the rhetoric. And in politics, that's usually where the real story starts, isn't it? The files themselves didn't arrive in any clean or orderly manner either. The Oversight Committee just dumped them in raw form. Badly labelled folders, screenshots, inconsistent formatting, multiple layers of redaction, missing metadata. Courier Newsroom had to rebuild the archive just to make it searchable, because the release was closer to a forensic challenge than a transparency exercise. But once it was ingested through Google Pinpoint, the entity panel became visible. That's where that 1,628 figure comes from. Not a partisan claim, not a journalist's interpretation or guesstimate, but a numerical fact extracted by software, no more, no less. And the thing about a numerical fact is that it doesn't care who benefits or who gets hurt by it. It simply returns what is in the archive. And what it returned was Trump's name stamped through the estate files more than anyone else's. And that's the point where the conversation leaves the realm of ideology, isn't it? Because volume is its own kind of truth. If your name appears that many times in the papers of a trafficker, the question isn't what you did, it's why it is there. The documents tell you what the references actually are. There's a 2017 email where Epstein wrote to former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers and called Trump the worst person he'd ever known, adding not one decent cell in his body, so yes, dangerous. That's not fringe opinion, that's Epstein talking about a man he moved in the same circles with, years after their supposed falling out. Then there's the 2011 message with Ghislaine Maxwell, in which Epstein wrote that the dog that hasn't barked is Trump, and referenced a victim who had spent hours at my house with him. The victim's name is redacted, and the document stops short of any direct allegation of criminal conduct, but the proximity is undeniable. You also see tracking, Epstein monitoring Trump's movements, logging his travel, watching his fundraisers, pulling articles, noting events, which suggests a kind of attention that doesn't match the public story of estrangement and dislike. And I'll come back to that, because it's one thing for a former friend to keep tabs on you, and another for a trafficker under scrutiny to keep a running record of your movements years after any claimed falling out. Further reporting adds another layer, because it confirms the email in which Epstein claimed that Trump knew about the girls. That is Epstein's claim, not independently verified evidence of Trump's knowledge of underage trafficking, but the presence of the claim in the estate files matters, because it turns what was previously rumour into something the congressional record now contains. And when you combine that with the volume of references, you start to see why the White House came out swinging the moment the documents were released. They didn't wait for context or interpretation or analysis. They called it a democratic smear before the public had even seen the counts, let alone the details. That defensive instinct tells its own story, because calm governments, they don't panic at documents they believe exonerate them, do they? They let transparency take its course. Panic is what happens when the documents don't align with the narrative you've been selling. And Trump himself hasn't managed this well at all. Reporters on Air Force One apparently asked about the emails, and the president shouted quiet at them, because that's what happens when the political problem is not the question, but the existence of the record. And this is why the numerical fact matters. If this was just 3 emails with redacted names on them, the White House could just drown that out in noise. But the volume makes that tactic absolutely useless. 1,628 document hits. It's not a narrative to argue with. It's a wall of evidence you either explain or avoid. And the White House has chosen avoidance. The problem is that Congress has run out of patience with that. And this is where the mechanics matter. A discharge petition needs 218 signatures. It got them. That forces a vote on the Epstein Files Transparency Act, which obliges the Department of Justice to release every unclassified Epstein-related document in its possession. And this is where the political stakes rise, because the DOJ archive is much larger than these estate files. Reports have confirmed that what we've seen so far is only a fraction of what the DOJ holds. Ledgers, diaries, calendars, full email exports, digital materials seized by investigators years ago. None of that is in the public domain yet. And I'll spell it out, because this is the moment where the scale becomes clear. If a fraction of the archive puts Trump's name at 1,628 mentions, the question isn't whether there will be more in the full set, is it? It's how many more. Trump's defenders have tried to anchor the conversation what's familiar. Clinton's flights, Clinton's previous friendship with Epstein, old media cycles. But the data doesn't support that framing anymore. And that's why this story is dangerous in a way the earlier cycles were not. Clinton appears in 392 documents. Certainly, there are questions to ask about that, aren't there? Obama appears in 421. Trump appears in over 4 times that number, though. The political narrative that always pushed Clinton to the centre collapses instantly when confronted by the actual record. And this isn't speculation, it's simple numerical ranking. If you want to understand who Epstein was thinking about, writing about, referring to, tracking and discussing the most, the list is right there, and Trump is right at the top of it. Now we'll deal with the obvious point, because it's the one the White House hangs on. None of this proves criminality. The emails and references do not establish that Trump committed offences or participated in Epstein's trafficking network. They show association, interest, commentary, criticism, travel logging, and references to shared social environments. They do not show direct involvement in Epstein's crimes, but that doesn't rescue Trump from the political crisis, because the problem is not guilt, the problem is proximity. When the estate files of a trafficker contain your name more than anyone else's, that's a national security issue, because it raises questions about compromise, leverage, and undisclosed relationships. You don't need conspiracy when you have numbers, and what makes this even more serious is the fact that a sitting president has direct influence over what the DOJ does and does not release. That is a conflict of interest so enormous it doesn't need any further embellishment. The man most mentioned in the files is the man with the most power over the files. And you don't need imagination to see why Congress is done leaving this to executive discretion, therefore. The Oversight Committee's messy release hints at another problem: redactions. Courier Newsroom noted that many documents were heavily blacked out, sometimes to the point of losing context. The DOJ controls redaction policy on unclassified records. They decide what falls under victim protection, what falls under ongoing investigation, and what falls under discretionary privacy shielding. I'm not questioning the legitimacy of protecting victims. That is non-negotiable. But you can see how a government could hide far more than victim details behind a blanket of redaction, can't you? Because once you wrap it in the language of protection, oversight has to fight uphill to reclaim transparency. And that's why the discharge petition matters so much. It forces the DOJ into statutory release, and statutory release reduces discretionary silence. In plain terms, it takes control out of the hands of the one person who stands to lose the most from full disclosure. So this brings me to the question that probably matters most, because it gets to the whole heart of the contradiction. Why did Epstein keep tracking Trump long after this supposed falling out? Reports show years of attention, counting travel, logging events, monitoring fundraisers, collecting articles. It's not what you do when a man has no influence on your world anymore, is it? That's what you do when someone still matters to your ecosystem. And again, this doesn't prove any wrongdoing. It simply proves proximity. Epstein tracked people when he believed they were useful, threatening, or positioned in ways that touched his interests. That's the pattern across his correspondence. So when you see Trump marked out as the dog that hasn't barked, you're looking at Epstein's own assessment that Trump was a missing piece in a story that otherwise had become public. And that line alone tells you why Trump has always reacted so violently to this story. The public line is one of distance. The private documents show persistent attention and proximity instead. Politics comes undone when the record contradicts the script. And you also have the problem of institutional memory too, because for 20 years, this story has been channeled through a Clinton-centric frame. The files break that open. They force the media to confront a documented reality that was hidden behind assumption and narrative momentum. And that matters because it changes the political terrain. Once the data contradicts the long-standing story, you have to ask who shaped that story and why. I won't speculate on motive because there's no direct evidence of coordination, at least none that we know of thus far. But the consequence is still obvious. The narrative shield that protected Trump by directing attention elsewhere has fallen. And once the shield drops, the record then takes over. There's one more point that he's saying because it sits at the junction of power and secrecy here. The President of the United States is at the top of the entity count in the estate files of a trafficker, and that president has influence through DOJ appointments, through executive priorities, through classification culture, over what parts of the remaining archives see daylight. That's not a sustainable position in a functioning democracy. No country can leave the release of compromising material to the discretion of the person most mentioned within it. And that's why this isn't a scandal story anymore, it's a transparency crisis. Congress knows that. You don't get 218 signatures on a discharge petition unless members in both parties think the risk of suppressing the files is higher than the risk of releasing them. And that tells you everything about where this is heading. The truth is the White House no longer has control of the frame. The number took that away now. 1,628 references is not a detail, it's a structural fact. It's the kind of fact that forces legislative action, fractures political alliances, and reshapes public narratives. And you can already see the pivot happening. Republicans who spent years defending Trump on this issue are stepping back because the political cost of defending a statistical outlier of this magnitude is just too high for them. Democrats obviously smell opportunity. But the point is not partisan, it's institutional. If the country is going to take Epstein's crime seriously, then it cannot ignore the presence of the sitting president at the top of the estate documents. And if it's going to claim transparency, then it cannot leave the fate of the remaining files to executive discretion. And that's where this story lands. So here's the verdict, because at this point the conclusion pretty much writes itself. When the estate files of Jeffrey Epstein mentioned the President of the United States more than Jeffrey Epstein himself, you're not looking at a scandal anymore. You're looking at a national security problem, a transparency crisis, and a political narrative that collapsed the moment the data was released. You can shout at reporters, you can blame Democrats, you can attack committees, and Trump, I'm sure, will continue to do so. But you can't talk down a number. And that's the thing Trump has never understood. The record doesn't care what he says. It only cares what it contains. And right now, it contains his name 1,628 times, and that is just for starters.